The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Prince Edward walked briskly through the ancient corridors. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls, each step measured and purposeful. Today was not like any other day. The weight of family responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the conversations he had overheard the night before still rang in his ears. Tom Parker Bowles had always been a complicated figure within the extended royal circle. As Camilla's eldest son from her first marriage, he occupied a unique position close enough to the inner workings of the monarchy to understand its intricacies, yet distant enough to sometimes forget the boundaries that governed royal behavior. What Edward had discovered about Tom's recent activities, however, went far beyond simple boundary crossing. The discovery had come about quite by accident. Edward had been returning from a late evening meeting with his private secretary when he noticed unusual activity in the east wing of the palace. Voices carried through the thick walls, and curiosity had gotten the better of him. What he heard changed everything he thought he knew about the current dynamics within the royal family. Tom Parker Bowles had been speaking with several individuals who were clearly not palace staff. The conversation, which Edward managed to overhear from an adjoining room, revealed a carefully orchestrated plan that sent chills down the prince's spine. Tom was discussing ways to undermine Prince George's position as third in line to the throne, suggesting that the young prince was unprepared for his future responsibilities and that alternative arrangements should be considered. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Tom had apparently been working behind the scenes for months, carefully building relationships with certain media contacts and even some members of parliament who had expressed concerns about the monarchy's future. His goal was clear: to create enough doubt about Prince George's suitability that serious discussions would begin about restructuring the line of succession. Edward understood immediately that this was not just about Tom's personal ambitions or grievances. This was about the very foundation of the constitutional monarchy that had served Britain for centuries. The idea that someone connected to the royal family would actively work to destabilize the established succession was unprecedented in modern times. The young Prince George, now 11 years old, represented the future of the monarchy in ways that went far beyond his position in the line of succession. He was being carefully prepared for his eventual role, receiving education and guidance that would help him understand the weight of royal responsibility. To suggest that he was somehow unfit or unprepared was not only untrue but deeply damaging to the institution itself. Edward spent the remainder of that sleepless night considering his options. As the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, he had always maintained a relatively low profile compared to his siblings. His work with the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme and various charitable organizations had kept him busy, but he had never been one to seek the spotlight or involve himself in palace politics. This situation, however, demanded action. The morning brought clarity to Edward's thinking. He realized that confronting Tom directly would be the most appropriate course of action, but he also understood that this conversation would need to be handled with extreme care. The implications of Tom's actions extended far beyond personal family dynamics. They touched on matters of constitutional importance and national stability. Edward's relationship with Camilla had always been respectful but distant. She had joined the family later in life, and, while he had welcomed her as his brother Charles's wife, they had never developed the close bond that sometimes forms between step-relatives. This situation would undoubtedly test whatever relationship they had built over the years. The prince made his way to his private study, where he began to review everything he knew about Tom Parker Bowles's recent activities. The man had always been something of a maverick, building a successful career as a food writer and critic while maintaining his independence from royal duties. Unlike his younger sister Laura, who had largely stayed out of the public eye, Tom had cultivated a media presence that sometimes bordered on controversial. Recent months had seen Tom making increasingly bold statements in interviews about the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain. Edward had initially dismissed these comments as the typical provocations of someone seeking attention. Now, however, he realized that they were part of a much more calculated campaign designed to plant seeds of doubt about the institution's future. The evidence Edward had gathered painted a troubling picture. Tom had been meeting regularly with a small group of individuals who shared his views about the need for modernization within the royal family. These meetings had initially focused on general discussions about the monarchy's role in contemporary society, but they had gradually evolved into something far more specific and dangerous. Phone records that Edward had been able to access through his security contacts showed extensive communication between Tom and several prominent critics of the monarchy. These were not casual conversations but detailed planning sessions that involved timing, messaging, and strategic coordination. The goal was to launch a coordinated campaign that would raise serious questions about Prince George's readiness to eventually assume the throne. The plan, as Edward understood it, involved a series of carefully timed media appearances and articles that would highlight various incidents from Prince George's young life and education. These incidents, while perfectly normal for any child, would be presented in a way that suggested concerning patterns of behavior or inadequate preparation for royal duties. Edward found this approach particularly disturbing because it targeted a child who had no ability to defend himself or respond to such attacks. Prince George's parents, William and Catherine, had worked hard to give their children as normal a childhood as possible while still preparing them for their future roles. To weaponize this careful balance for political purposes was unconscionable. The constitutional implications of Tom's plan were equally serious. The line of succession had been established through centuries of law and tradition, modified most recently by the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which ended male primogeniture and allowed daughters equal inheritance rights. To suggest that these laws and traditions could be casually discarded based on subjective assessments of individual suitability would set a dangerous precedent. Edward understood that the monarchy's strength came from its stability and predictability. The British people and the Commonwealth realms relied on clear rules of succession that were not subject to political manipulation or personal opinion. Tom's plan threatened to undermine this fundamental principle and replace it with a system based on popular opinion and media manipulation. As Edward continued his research, he discovered that Tom's activities had not gone entirely unnoticed by palace security. There had been reports of unusual meetings and communications, but these had been classified as routine monitoring rather than serious security concerns. The full scope of the plan had only become clear when Edward connected various pieces of information that had been treated as separate incidents. The prince realized that he would need to act quickly but carefully. Tom's plan appeared to be nearing its implementation phase, with several media appearances already scheduled. Once the campaign began in earnest, it would be much more difficult to contain the damage or counter the narrative that Tom and his associates intended to create. Edward's first step was to inform his brother Charles about the situation. As the current monarch and Tom's stepfather, Charles needed to be aware of what was happening within his own household. This conversation would be particularly delicate because it involved Camilla's son and could potentially strain the relationship between Charles and his wife. The meeting with Charles took place in the king's private study at Buckingham Palace. Edward presented his findings methodically, providing evidence and context for each element of Tom's plan. Charles listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave as the full scope of the situation became clear. "This is far worse than I imagined," Charles said finally, after Edward had finished his presentation. "I knew Tom had been making some controversial statements, but I assumed they were just his way of maintaining his media profile. This suggests something much more organized and deliberate." Edward nodded grimly. "The timing concerns me most of all. Prince George is at a vulnerable age where any negative publicity could have lasting effects on his development and his relationship with his future role. Tom seems to understand this and is deliberately choosing this moment to strike." The two brothers discussed various options for addressing the situation. Simply talking to Tom privately might not be sufficient, given the level of planning and commitment he had already demonstrated. On the other hand, a public confrontation could create exactly the kind of media circus that Tom's plan was designed to exploit. Charles expressed particular concern about how this situation would affect Camilla. As Tom's mother, she would naturally want to protect her son, but, as queen consort, she had responsibilities to the institution that might conflict with her maternal instincts. The situation had the potential to create serious tensions within the royal marriage. "I think we need to consider this from multiple angles," Edward suggested. "Tom's actions affect not just Prince George and our family, but the constitutional framework that supports our entire system of government. This isn't just a family dispute, it's a matter of national importance." Charles agreed, and they began to develop a strategy that would address both the immediate threat posed by Tom's plan and the longer-term implications for the monarchy. The approach would need to be firm enough to stop Tom's current activities while also sending a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated from anyone connected to the royal family. The conversation lasted for more than 2 hours, with both brothers carefully considering every aspect of the situation. They discussed the legal implications of Tom's actions, the potential impact on public opinion, and the precedent that their response would set for future challenges to the monarchy. By the end of their meeting, Charles and Edward had agreed on a course of action that would involve a direct confrontation with Tom, but one that was carefully planned and executed to minimize the potential for public embarrassment or constitutional crisis. Edward would take the lead in this confrontation, given his role in discovering the plot and his relative distance from the family politics involved. The decision to have Edward handle the situation was strategic. As the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's children, he had always been seen as someone who stayed above the fray of royal politics. His intervention would carry particular weight precisely because he was not known for involving himself in such matters. When Prince Edward spoke, people listened, because they knew he would not act without serious cause. Edward spent the next several days preparing for his confrontation with Tom Parker Bowles. He consulted with constitutional experts, legal advisors, and security professionals to ensure that he fully understood both the immediate situation and its broader implications. He also worked closely with the palace press office to develop contingency plans for various scenarios that might emerge from his conversation with Tom. The timing of the confrontation was carefully chosen. Edward waited until Tom had scheduled his next media appearance, which was set to take place in just 5 days. This gave Edward sufficient time to prepare while also creating urgency that would make it clear to Tom that his plans had been discovered and would not be allowed to proceed. The location for the meeting was also significant. Edward chose to meet Tom at Bagshot Park, Edward's own residence, rather than at one of the official royal palaces. This choice was designed to make the conversation feel more personal and direct while also ensuring privacy and security. It would be a setting where both men could speak freely without the formal protocols that governed interactions at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. As Edward prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of his royal career, he reflected on the broader challenges facing the modern monarchy. The institution had survived and thrived for more than 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core principles and traditions. Tom's plan represented a fundamental challenge to this delicate balance. The prince understood that his actions in the coming days would be remembered as a defining moment in his own career and, potentially in the history of the modern monarchy. The stakes could not be higher: the protection of a young prince who represented the future of the institution, the preservation of constitutional principles that had served Britain for centuries, and the maintenance of family unity in the face of unprecedented internal challenges. Edward's final preparations included reaching out to his niece and nephew, William and Catherine, to inform them of the situation involving their son. This conversation was particularly difficult because it involved discussing threats to their child's future that they had been completely unaware of. Both parents were shocked by the revelation but grateful that Edward had discovered the plot before it could be implemented. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not only Tom Parker Bowles' future relationship with the royal family but also the precedent for how such challenges to the monarchy would be handled in the future. Edward had never imagined that his role as a working royal would involve protecting the institution from threats that came from within the extended family itself, but he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to preserve the dignity and stability of the crown. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived with an unusual chill in the air, as if nature itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold at Bagshot Park. Prince Edward had barely slept, spending much of the night reviewing his notes and considering different approaches to the conversation ahead. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever as he prepared to confront Tom Parker Bowles about activities that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. Edward's staff had been given strict instructions about maintaining absolute discretion regarding the meeting. Only his most trusted private secretary knew the full details of why Tom had been invited to Bagshot Park that morning. The official explanation was simply that the prince wanted to discuss some family matters privately, which was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the true nature of the crisis. Tom arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving himself in a modest car that reflected his preference for maintaining some independence from royal protocols. Edward watched from his study window as Tom parked and walked toward the main entrance. There was something in Tom's posture and demeanor that suggested confidence, even arrogance, as if he believed his activities had gone undetected and his plans were proceeding according to schedule. The two men had met on numerous occasions over the years, typically at family gatherings or formal events where their interactions had been polite but limited. Tom had always maintained a somewhat casual attitude toward royal protocol, which Edward had initially attributed to his background outside the formal royal structure. Now, however, that casual disregard for boundaries took on a more sinister significance. Edward greeted Tom in the entrance hall with the same courtesy he would show any guest, but there was an underlying tension that both men could feel. Tom seemed initially relaxed, perhaps expecting a routine family discussion or even a social visit. His demeanor began to change, however, when Edward led him not to the comfortable sitting room where such conversations typically took place, but to the more formal study where the prince conducted official business. "Tom, I appreciate you taking the time to visit this morning," Edward began, his tone carefully neutral. "I believe we have some important matters to discuss that affect not just our family, but the institution we all serve in various ways." Tom's expression shifted slightly at these words, a flicker of wariness crossing his features. "Of course, Edward. I'm always happy to discuss family matters. Though I have to say, your invitation was rather mysterious. Is everything all right with Mum and Charles?" Edward paused for a moment, studying Tom's face carefully. The man was a skilled communicator, someone who had built a career on his ability to read situations and respond appropriately. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he suspected this conversation might not be as routine as he had hoped. "Your mother and the king are quite well, thank you. However, I'm afraid this conversation concerns activities that could potentially affect their well-being, along with that of other family members." Edward moved to his desk, where he had arranged several folders containing the evidence he had gathered. "I become aware of some concerning developments that I believe we need to address directly." Tom's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He was clearly trying to maintain his composure, but Edward could see the wheels turning as Tom attempted to determine how much Edward actually knew about his plans. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to," Tom replied, though his voice had lost some of its initial confidence. "I hope there hasn't been some misunderstanding about something I've said or done." Edward opened the first folder and removed several documents. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Tom. Over the past several weeks, I've become aware of meetings you've been having with various individuals outside the family. These meetings appear to have been focused on developing a strategy to undermine Prince George's position in the line of succession." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation that could not be taken back. Tom's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, defiance, and, finally, a kind of resigned acknowledgement that his activities had been discovered. "I think you may be misinterpreting some perfectly legitimate discussions about the future of the monarchy," Tom said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "These are important constitutional questions that deserve serious consideration." Edward leaned forward in his chair, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Tom, I have detailed records of phone calls, meeting locations, and even some recorded conversations. This goes far beyond legitimate constitutional discussion. You've been actively working to destabilize the established succession and undermine a child who cannot defend himself." The evidence Edward presented was overwhelming. Phone records showed extensive communication with known critics of the monarchy. Meeting logs revealed a pattern of coordination with individuals who had previously published articles questioning royal relevance. Most damning of all were transcripts of conversations where Tom had explicitly discussed timing strategies for releasing negative information about Prince George. Tom's initial attempts at denial gradually gave way to justification as the weight of evidence made further deception impossible. "Perhaps I have been exploring certain options," he admitted. "But, you have to understand, Edward, the monarchy is facing unprecedented challenges. Public support is declining, especially among younger generations. We need to be prepared for all possibilities. And, you decided that undermining an 11-year-old boy was the appropriate way to address these challenges?" Edward's voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Tom, what you're describing isn't constitutional planning, it's a coordinated attack on the very principles that have sustained our system for centuries." The conversation continued for more than an hour, with Tom alternating between justification and defiance. He argued that the monarchy needed to modernize, that the public deserves to have input into who would eventually lead the institution, and that Prince George's youth made him a legitimate target for scrutiny about his future readiness. Edward systematically dismantled each of these arguments. He pointed out that the monarchy's stability came from its predictability and adherence to established law, not from subjective assessments of individual suitability. He reminded Tom that Prince George was receiving the same careful education and preparation that had been provided to every future monarch, and that attacking a child's development was both unfair and counterproductive. "You seem to misunderstand the fundamental nature of constitutional monarchy," Edward explained. "The strength of our system comes from the fact that succession is determined by law and tradition, not by popular opinion or media manipulation. What you're proposing would replace centuries of stability with chaos." Tom's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about royal duty and constitutional responsibility. But surely we should consider whether someone is actually suited for the role before they're thrust into it, he argued. The public has a right to know what kind of king Prince George might become. The public has a right to a stable constitutional system, Edward replied firmly. What they don't have is the right to interfere with the established succession based on speculation about a child's future development. Your plan would set a precedent that would make the monarchy subject to political manipulation and media campaigns. As the conversation progressed, it became clear that Tom had fundamentally misunderstood both his role within the extended royal family and the nature of constitutional monarchy itself. He seemed to believe that his connection to the royal family through his mother gave him some kind of standing to influence succession matters, when in fact it gave him additional responsibilities to protect and preserve the institution. Edward explained the broader implications of Tom's actions with the patience of someone who understood that the stakes extended far beyond personal disagreements. Tom, what you've been doing doesn't just affect Prince George or even our family. It threatens the constitutional framework that supports our entire system of government. The monarchy's relationship with Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, and the British people depends on the predictability and legitimacy of succession. The prince also addressed the personal dimension of Tom's betrayal. Beyond the constitutional issues, you've violated the trust that comes with your position within our family. Your mother has worked hard to build her place within the royal family, and your actions could seriously damage her standing and her relationship with the king. This last point seemed to affect Tom more than any of the constitutional arguments. For the first time in their conversation, he appeared to truly consider the impact of his actions on others, particularly his mother. Camilla had spent years building her reputation and finding her place within the royal family, often facing significant public scrutiny and criticism. Tom's actions threatened to undo much of that progress and potentially create serious tensions within the royal marriage. I never intended for this to affect Mom, Tom said quietly, and, for the first time, his voice carried genuine regret rather than justification or defiance. But it will affect her, Edward replied. When word of your activities becomes known, and it will become known, she will be forced to choose between supporting your actions or supporting the institution she has sworn to serve. That's not a choice any mother should have to make, and it's not a choice you should have forced upon her. Edward then outlined the immediate steps that needed to be taken to prevent further damage. Tom would need to cancel his scheduled media appearances and cease all communication with the individuals who had been helping him plan his campaign against Prince George. Any materials that had been prepared for release would need to be destroyed, and Tom would need to provide assurances that he would not resume these activities in the future. I understand you may feel that I'm being heavy-handed, Edward said, but you need to understand that this situation has moved far beyond the realm of family disagreement. Your actions have constitutional implications that could affect the stability of our entire system of government. Tom's response to these demands revealed both his continuing misunderstanding of the situation and his growing realization that his plans would not be allowed to proceed. You're asking me to abandon important discussions about the future of democracy in Britain, he protested. I'm asking you to stop attacking a child and undermining constitutional law, Edward replied bluntly. If you want to discuss the future of democracy, there are appropriate forums and legitimate ways to do so. Coordinating media attacks on an 11-year-old prince is neither appropriate nor legitimate. The conversation reached a turning point when Edward made clear the consequences of Tom's refusal to comply with these demands. The evidence of his activities would be shared with appropriate security services, and formal steps would be taken to ensure that he had no further access to sensitive information about royal family members. His invitations to family events would be revoked, and his mother would be informed of his actions in full detail. You're essentially asking me to choose between my principles and my family, Tom said, though his earlier defiance had given way to something closer to resignation. I'm asking you to recognize that your principles, as you call them, are fundamentally incompatible with your position within this family and with the constitutional system we serve, Edward replied. The choice you're describing is one you created through your own actions. Edward also addressed the broader question of Tom's future relationship with the royal family. While there was no desire to create a permanent estrangement, his actions had demonstrated such poor judgment and disregard for family loyalty that significant changes would be necessary. Trust, once broken, is extremely difficult to rebuild, Edward explained. Your actions have shown that you're willing to use your family connections to attack the very institution that gives those connections meaning. That kind of betrayal has consequences that extend far beyond this single incident. Tom's final attempts to justify his actions revealed the extent to which he had convinced himself that his plan was not only legitimate but necessary. He argued that he was trying to save the monarchy from itself, that he was providing a service by raising important questions about future leadership. Edward's response was measured but firm. "Tom, you're not saving anything. You're attacking it. The monarchy has survived and thrived for more than 1,000 years by adapting to change while maintaining its core principles. What you're proposing would destroy those principles and replace them with political manipulation." The meeting concluded with Tom's reluctant agreement to Edward's demands. He would cancel his media appearances, cease contact with his co-conspirators, and provide written assurances that he would not resume these activities. In return, Edward agreed not to pursue formal legal action, though he made clear that this forbearance was contingent on Tom's complete compliance with the terms they had discussed. As Tom prepared to leave Bagshot Park, the full weight of what had occurred began to settle on both men. For Edward, it was the successful resolution of a serious threat to the monarchy, but also the recognition that the challenges facing the institution were more complex and closer to home than he had ever imagined. For Tom, it was the end of a plan he had believed was both important and achievable, along with the beginning of a period of reflection about his role within the extended royal family. The conversation had lasted nearly 3 hours, and both men were emotionally drained by its intensity and implications. Edward walked Tom to his car in silence, neither man quite sure what to say after such a confrontational but necessary discussion. "I hope you'll take time to consider what we've discussed today," Edward said as Tom reached his vehicle. "Your actions could have had consequences that extended far beyond anything you intended." Tom nodded slowly, his earlier confidence completely absent. "I suppose I need to think about a lot of things," he replied. "I never meant for this to become such a serious matter." "But it did become serious," Edward observed. "And that's something we all need to remember going forward." The immediate aftermath of Edward's confrontation with Tom Parker Bowles brought a period of tense uncertainty to the royal family. While Tom had agreed to Edward's demands and cancelled his scheduled media appearances, the damage assessment and long-term implications of his actions required careful consideration from the highest levels of the monarchy. Edward spent the evening following his meeting with Tom in deep consultation with King Charles. The conversation with his brother was even more difficult than the confrontation with Tom had been, because it involved not just constitutional matters but intimate family dynamics that threatened to tear apart relationships that had taken years to build. Charles received the news about Tom's activities with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and deep concern for how this would affect Camilla. As both a king and a stepfather, he found himself facing conflicting loyalties and responsibilities that had no easy resolution. The conversation took place in the king's private study at Clarence House, away from the formal protocols of Buckingham Palace, allowing for the kind of honest discussion that the situation demanded. "I knew Tom could be difficult," Charles admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. "But I never imagined he would go this far. The idea that he would target George, a child who has done nothing but try to prepare for his future responsibilities, is simply unconscionable." Edward nodded grimly. "What concerns me most is the level of organization involved. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst or a moment of poor judgment. Tom spent months planning this campaign, building relationships with critics of the monarchy, and coordinating timing for maximum impact. That suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of his obligations to this family." The two brothers discussed the immediate practical steps that needed to be taken. Tom's access to royal family information would need to be restricted immediately, and his invitations to official events would be suspended pending a full review of the situation. More importantly, they needed to develop a strategy for addressing the potential security vulnerabilities that Tom's actions had revealed. "We need to consider whether others might have similar ideas," Edward observed. "If Tom was able to organize this kind of campaign, there may be other individuals with connections to the family who could pose similar threats. We need to review our security protocols and information sharing procedures." Charles agreed, and they spent considerable time discussing the broader implications for family security and the protection of sensitive information. The incident with Tom had revealed weaknesses in the systems designed to protect the royal family from both external threats and internal betrayals. The most delicate aspect of their discussion concerned how to handle the situation with Camilla. As Tom's mother, she had a right to know what had happened, but the revelation would undoubtedly cause her significant distress and potentially damage her relationship with both Charles and the broader royal family. She needs to hear this from us directly, Charles decided after considerable deliberation. If she learns about it from Tom or through some other channel, the damage to trust could be irreparable. But, we need to approach this carefully, with full consideration for her position and her feelings. Edward agreed, though he recognized the challenges involved in such a conversation. Camilla had worked hard to establish her place within the royal family, often facing significant public scrutiny and criticism. The revelation that her son had been working to undermine the monarchy from within would be devastating on both personal and professional levels. The conversation with Camilla took place the following evening, again in the private setting of Clarence House. Edward had prepared carefully for this discussion, knowing that his relationship with his sister-in-law would likely be forever changed by what he was about to reveal. Camilla's initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed quickly by anger and, then, a deep sadness as the full implications became clear. "I can't believe Tom would do something like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know he's had his disagreements with some aspects of royal life, but, to actually work against the family, against George, it's unthinkable." Charles took his wife's hand as Edward provided a detailed account of Tom's activities and the evidence that had been gathered. The conversation was one of the most difficult Edward had ever participated in, watching as a mother grappled with the realization that her son had betrayed not just the royal family but the principles she had worked so hard to uphold. "What does this mean for me?" Camilla asked eventually. "My son has attacked the very institution I've sworn to serve. How can I continue in my role knowing that my family has caused such harm?" Edward's response was carefully considered. "Your role and your contributions to this family are not diminished by Tom's actions. He made his choices independently, and, while they affect all of us, they don't reflect on your character or your commitment to the monarchy." Charles echoed this sentiment, but the strain on the royal marriage was evident. The situation placed both spouses in impossible positions, torn between family loyalty and institutional duty. Camilla would need to distance herself from her son's actions while still maintaining her role as his mother, a balancing act that would require extraordinary strength and wisdom. Over the following days, Edward worked closely with palace security and legal advisors to ensure that all aspects of Tom's activities were fully understood and properly addressed. The investigation revealed that Tom's network of contacts was more extensive than initially realized, involving not just media figures but also some individuals with connections to political organizations that had expressed Republican sentiments. The security review also uncovered several concerning gaps in the protocols designed to protect sensitive family information. Tom's position as Camilla's son had given him access to certain social occasions and informal discussions where family matters were sometimes discussed casually. This access had allowed him to gather information about Prince George's education and development that he had then used in planning his campaign. "We need to fundamentally rethink how we manage information within the extended family," Edward told the head of royal security. "The traditional approach of treating family members as inherently trustworthy is no longer adequate in an age when personal grievances can be amplified through modern media and communication technologies." New protocols were developed that would limit access to sensitive information based on specific roles and demonstrated reliability rather than family connections alone. While these changes were necessary for security reasons, they also represented a significant shift in how the royal family operated internally, moving from a model based on trust and informal relationships to one with more formal boundaries and restrictions. Edward also took steps to assess the potential damage that Tom's planned campaign might have caused if it had been allowed to proceed. Working with media relations experts and constitutional scholars, he developed an understanding of how such attacks might have affected public perception of Prince George and the monarchy more broadly. The analysis was sobering. Tom's strategy of targeting Prince George's youth and development could have been particularly effective because it would have been difficult to counter without appearing defensive or drawing even more attention to unfounded criticisms. The timing of the planned campaign, coinciding with several high-profile royal events, could have maximized media coverage and public discussion. "What's particularly disturbing is how well-crafted the strategy was," Edward observed during one of his briefings. Tom clearly understood how to manipulate media cycles and public opinion. This wasn't the work of an amateur, it was a professional quality campaign designed to cause maximum damage. The investigation also revealed that Tom had been in contact with several foreign journalists and media outlets, suggesting that his campaign was intended to extend beyond British media to international coverage. This added another layer of concern about the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation in Commonwealth realms and other countries where the British royal family played important ceremonial roles. Edward's report to King Charles about these findings led to additional security measures and a comprehensive review of how the royal family engaged with international media. The incident had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond Tom's specific actions and required systematic changes to protect against similar threats in the future. The response from other family members varied significantly. Prince William and Catherine expressed gratitude to Edward for protecting their son, but also concern about the broader implications for family security and unity. The idea that someone within their extended family had been planning to attack their child was profoundly disturbing and led to discussions about additional security measures and restrictions on George's public appearances. Princess Anne, known for her direct approach to family matters, was particularly critical of Tom's actions and supportive of Edward's response. "Anyone who attacks a child in this family attacks all of us," she declared during a family meeting convened to discuss the situation. Edward did exactly what needed to be done, and Tom is fortunate that the consequences weren't more severe. The reaction from other royal cousins and extended family members was more mixed, with some expressing concern about the precedent being set for handling family disputes and others supporting the strong action taken to protect Prince George. These discussions revealed underlying tensions within the extended royal family about boundaries, loyalty, and the balance between family relationships and institutional responsibilities. Edward found himself in the unusual position of having to defend his actions to some family members who felt that the situation could have been handled more quietly or with less dramatic consequences for Tom. These critics argued that family matters should be resolved through private discussion and compromise rather than the kind of direct confrontation that Edward had chosen. "I understand the desire to handle family matters quietly," Edward responded to one such criticism. But this situation moved beyond the realm of family dispute when Tom began organizing a public campaign against Prince George. At that point, it became a matter of institutional protection that required a clear and decisive response. The broader implications of the incident extended to questions about the role and status of extended family members who were connected to the monarchy through marriage but not directly in the line of succession. Tom's actions highlighted the potential risks of including such individuals in family discussions and events without clear guidelines about their responsibilities and limitations. Edward worked with constitutional experts to develop new guidelines that would clarify the expectations for extended family members while still maintaining the inclusive approach that had characterized the modern royal family. These guidelines would help prevent future misunderstandings about roles and responsibilities while protecting against individuals who might seek to exploit family connections for personal or political purposes. The incident also prompted a broader review of how the royal family prepared younger members for their future roles and protected them from inappropriate scrutiny or attack. Prince George's experience, while ultimately prevented from becoming public, highlighted the vulnerabilities faced by royal children in an age of intense media attention and social media amplification. Edward proposed enhanced protection protocols for younger royals that would include not just physical security but also monitoring and response capabilities for media and social media threats. These measures would help ensure that future attacks, whether from within the family or from external sources, could be detected and addressed before they caused harm to the children involved. The weeks following Edward's confrontation with Tom were marked by a careful process of rebuilding and strengthening family relationships while implementing the security and protocol changes that the incident had revealed as necessary. Edward found himself playing a central role in these efforts, having demonstrated leadership and judgment that earned him increased respect within the family and among palace staff. His handling of the Tom Parker Bowles situation was widely regarded as a masterclass in crisis management, combining firmness with fairness and protecting the institution while minimizing unnecessary damage to family relationships. The incident established Edward as a key figure in the family's security and stability, someone who could be trusted to act decisively when institutional interests were at stake. The long-term consequences of the affair continued to unfold as the royal family adapted to new realities about trust, security, and the challenges of maintaining unity while protecting against internal threats. Edward's actions had not just resolved an immediate crisis but had also established important precedents for how similar situations would be handled in the future. 6 months after the confrontation at Bagshot Park, the long-term consequences of Tom Parker Bowles's attempted campaign against Prince George had fundamentally changed the dynamics within the extended royal family. Edward's decisive intervention had not only prevented a constitutional crisis but had also established new standards for family loyalty and institutional protection that would influence royal relationships for years to come. The immediate aftermath had seen Tom withdraw almost completely from public life. His planned book about food and family had been quietly cancelled by his publisher, and his regular appearances on television cooking shows had ceased altogether. The man who had once enjoyed a comfortable public profile as Camilla's charming and irreverent son had become virtually invisible, spending most of his time at his country home, apparently reassessing his relationship with both his family and his own future. Edward had maintained minimal contact with Tom during this period, primarily through formal channels when family matters required coordination. The relationship between the two men had been permanently altered by their confrontation, moving from polite distance to something closer to mutual wariness. Edward understood that Tom might harbor resentment about being exposed and stopped, while Edward himself could never quite forget the calculated nature of Tom's betrayal. The impact on Camilla had been perhaps the most visible consequence of the entire affair. The Queen Consort had thrown herself into her royal duties with even greater dedication, as if trying to compensate for her son's actions through her own increased service to the institution. Her relationship with Prince George had become notably closer during this period, with the Queen Consort apparently making special efforts to demonstrate her support for the young prince's development and preparation for his future role. Edward observed these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. His intervention had achieved its primary goal of protecting Prince George and preserving constitutional stability, but the personal costs to family relationships had been significant. Camilla's obvious distress and her attempts to make amends for her son's actions were painful to witness, even though Edward remained convinced that his response had been both necessary and appropriate. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had weathered the crisis, but not without strain. Edward had observed subtle changes in their interactions during family gatherings, a new formality that suggested ongoing private discussions about trust, loyalty, and the competing demands of family and institutional responsibilities. The king had publicly supported his wife throughout the affair, but the private conversations between the couple undoubtedly included difficult discussions about boundaries and expectations. Prince William and Catherine had responded to the crisis by becoming even more protective of their children's privacy and more selective about family gatherings and events. The revelation that someone within their extended family had been planning to attack their son had fundamentally changed their approach to family relationships, introducing new levels of caution and security consciousness that affected every aspect of their children's upbringing. Edward had spent considerable time with William and Catherine in the months following the incident, helping them process the implications and adjust their family security protocols accordingly. These conversations had strengthened Edward's relationship with his nephew and his wife while also highlighting the broader challenges facing the next generation of royals in protecting their children from both external and internal threats. Prince George himself had remained largely unaware of the specific details of what had occurred, though his parents had carefully explained that some people might sometimes say unkind things about their family and that such comments should not be taken seriously. The young prince's continued development and education had proceeded normally, but with enhanced security measures that reflected the new understanding of potential vulnerabilities. Edward's role within the family had evolved significantly as a result of his handling of the Tom Parker Bowles affair. He had emerged as something of an elder statesman, someone who could be trusted to act decisively when family and institutional interests were at stake. This new role brought increased responsibilities but also greater influence in family discussions and decision-making processes. The security protocols developed in response to Tom's activities had been refined and expanded to address other potential vulnerabilities within the extended royal family. These measures included enhanced background checks for individuals attending family events, new restrictions on information sharing, and improved monitoring capabilities for potential threats from both internal and external sources. Edward had worked closely with intelligence services and security professionals to develop these new protocols while trying to maintain the relatively open and inclusive approach that had characterized the modern royal family. The balance between security and accessibility remained delicate, requiring constant adjustment as circumstances changed and new threats emerged. The constitutional implications of Tom's planned campaign had prompted broader discussions within government circles about the protection of the monarchy from internal threats. These discussions had led to new legal frameworks and security arrangements that strengthened the institution's ability to respond to similar challenges while maintaining appropriate respect for civil liberties and family relationships. Edward's handling of the crisis had been studied and praised by constitutional experts as an example of how traditional institutions could adapt to modern threats without abandoning their core principles. The combination of firmness and discretion had protected both the immediate interests of the royal family and the broader constitutional framework that supported the monarchy's role in British society. The incident had also prompted new educational initiatives within the royal family about constitutional responsibilities and the importance of loyalty to institutional values. These programs were designed particularly for younger family members and those who married into the family, helping ensure that everyone understood both their privileges and their obligations as members of the extended royal circle. Tom's associates in his planned campaign had faced their own consequences following Edward's intervention. Several journalists and media figures had found their access to royal events restricted or eliminated entirely, while some had faced professional repercussions from their employers who were concerned about the ethical implications of participating in coordinated attacks on royal children. The broader media landscape had also been affected by the revelations about Tom's activities. News organizations had developed new editorial guidelines about coverage of royal children, recognizing that participation in orchestrated campaigns against minors could have serious legal and ethical consequences. These changes reflected a broader understanding of the responsibilities that came with covering the royal family in the modern era. Edward's relationship with the media had become more complex as a result of the affair. While he had always maintained a relatively low profile compared to other senior royals, his decisive action in protecting Prince George had earned him increased respect from responsible journalists while also making him a target for critics who felt that his intervention had been excessive or inappropriate. The prince had handled this increased attention with his characteristic discretion, rarely commenting publicly on the Tom Parker Bowles affair but allowing his actions to speak for themselves. When he did address the matter, it was typically in the context of broader discussions about royal family security and the importance of protecting children from inappropriate political manipulation. International observers had watched the handling of the crisis with considerable interest, particularly in Commonwealth realms where the stability of the monarchy had direct constitutional implications. Edward's measured but firm response had been widely praised as an example of how traditional institutions could protect themselves from modern threats while maintaining their essential character and values. The incident had also influenced discussions within other European royal families about security protocols and internal threat assessment. Several of Edward's counterparts in other monarchies had reached out to discuss the lessons learned and the security measures implemented, recognizing that the challenges faced by the British royal family were increasingly common across all traditional institutions. As the months passed, Edward found himself reflecting on the broader lessons of the Tom Parker Bowles affair. The incident had revealed both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of the modern monarchy, demonstrating how quickly internal threats could emerge but also how effectively they could be addressed when met with appropriate determination and wisdom. The most important lesson, Edward believed, was the necessity of vigilance combined with proportionate response. The royal family could not operate in a state of constant suspicion and mistrust, but neither could it afford to ignore warning signs of internal threats. The key was developing systems and relationships that allowed for early detection and appropriate intervention before situations escalated to crisis levels. Edward's own role had evolved in ways he had never expected when he first became aware of Tom's activities. The youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II had become a guardian of institutional stability, someone who could be counted on to act decisively when fundamental principles were at stake. This transformation had brought new responsibilities but also new satisfaction in serving the monarchy and protecting future generations of royals. The relationship between Edward and Prince George had strengthened considerably during this period, with the older prince taking a more active role in the young future king's education and development. These interactions provided opportunities for Edward to share his understanding of royal duty and constitutional responsibility while also ensuring that Prince George understood the importance of the institution he would someday lead. The final resolution of the Tom Parker Bowles matter came not through any formal reconciliation or public statement, but through the gradual acceptance of new realities by all parties involved. Tom had effectively excluded himself from royal family life through his actions, while the family had adapted its practices and protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. Camilla had found her own way to address her son's betrayal, maintaining her role as queen consort while also making clear her complete support for the institutional values that Tom had attempted to undermine. Her grace under pressure had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened her position within the royal family, demonstrating a loyalty and commitment that transcended personal family relationships. Edward's legacy from the affair would be his demonstration that quiet effectiveness could be more powerful than public confrontation in protecting institutional values. His willingness to act decisively when necessary, combined with his preference for discretion over drama, had established a new model for how senior royals could address internal threats while maintaining family unity and public confidence. The monarchy had emerged from the crisis stronger and more secure, with new protocols and understanding that would serve it well in facing future challenges. Edward's intervention had not just prevented one specific threat but had also established principles and procedures that would protect the institution for years to come. As he looked back on the events that had begun with overheard conversations in the corridors of Windsor Castle, Edward felt satisfaction in having fulfilled one of the most important responsibilities of his royal role, protecting the institution that had served Britain for more than 1,000 years and ensuring its continued stability for future generations. The Tom Parker Bowles affair had tested the royal family in unexpected ways, but their response had demonstrated the enduring strength of constitutional monarchy when guided by wisdom, courage, and unwavering commitment to duty above all else. The precedent set by Edward's actions would influence how similar situations were handled in the future, establishing clear expectations for family loyalty while also demonstrating that the monarchy was capable of protecting itself from internal threats without abandoning its essential character or values. In the end, the affair had strengthened rather than weakened the institution, proving once again that the British monarchy could adapt to modern challenges while maintaining the traditions and principles that gave it meaning and authority.